A ton of us Commander players are always on the search for ways to tune up our decks and make them more efficient. Plenty of videos on this very channel examine ways and resources to help you make your decks more consistent, more powerful, more likely to do the thing. However, sometimes we can get a little carried away, right? Let me be the first to say that sometimes I get a little lost in the sauce. Sometimes we end up tuning things up to such a level of mechanical efficiency that it turns out we've optimized the joy out of the game. This is a common experience in the evolution of a Commander player. A lot of us go through these stages along the deck building process of learning how to play, getting excited to brew stuff, discovering powerful interactions, and then focusing on how to make those interactions more consistent. But then at some point, we look behind us at the path that we've just traveled, and we yearn for the things that we left behind along the way. I'm Joey, welcome back to the channel. Let's get EDH wrecked, and let's talk about how to de-optimize your Commander decks. This video may not apply to everyone out there. For many folks, the idea of tuning down a deck is uninteresting. It might feel like backtracking or returning to a style of gameplay that you don't necessarily enjoy as much as you used to. And nowadays, chasing the complex and perfectly efficient versions of Magic is what you find more thrilling. But there are many players out there who hit this point where they kinda long to get back in touch with some of Magic's simple joys. And those of you who are indeed at that stage of the game, this video is for you. And for those who don't relate to that experience at all, well, hopefully this video still helps you to understand that other perspective a little bit. Regardless of whichever way you fall, this video is here to help you better identify the types of potential podmates who will vibe with the game in the same way that you do. Neither way of playing Magic is right or wrong, and at the end of the day, we can all relate to the goal of finding a way to make the game more fun for ourselves and for others. So, how do you detune your Commander deck? Well, as per tradition with YouTube video essays, I've compiled the steps into an internet-friendly numbered list. First things first, let's examine what we even mean by that. When we say that we're tuning down a deck, that doesn't mean that we want to make it garbage. We could curb the land count, remove all of the draw spells, scupper the ratio of enablers and payoffs, and we would sure have a weaker deck, all right. We could even turn it into a pile of 99 forests, But that is not really what we mean by tune down or de-optimize a deck. What we're actually trying to do here is make sure that the deck can still, play Magic. It's just not going to be a bullet train anymore. Instead, it's taking the scenic route. That means step one of this process is to identify properly what scenes it is that you're hoping to see along that scenic route. Critically ask yourself, why are you interested in tuning the deck down? For some people, it's because they want to play more pet cards, for instance. A pet card of mine is Cartographer. That artwork will never not make me smile. It's so gorgeous. The card's abilities have been pretty outclassed, but maybe taking out some of the efficient cards from a deck and playing more of those types of pet cards would bring me more joy. But for other people, consistency might be the problem. The deck could be super good at always performing exactly the same way every single time. So then from game to game, the deck might start to feel stale. In that case, just swapping in a couple of pet cards might not be enough. Rather, the deck would need a bigger structural overhaul to increase its overall variance. What that player needs isn't some pet cards, it's a full body electric shock that will reinvigorate the entire list with more novelty. Other players still might want to bring a deck down a bracket so that they can play it more often, say because people near them play more bracket 3 games than bracket 4 games, or they want to bring a bracket 3 deck down to a bracket 2 to fit better with a given playgroup. Or maybe other players have told them that their decks are too good, so they gotta change it up, stuff like that. In that case, it's not just going to be about, overall structure and pet cards and things like that, but now we also have to factor in game changers and the deck's overall speed and velocity and things like that. There are tons more reasons why someone might want to tune a deck down a bit, but the point is, not all of these solutions are going to be one size fits all. Just because something worked for somebody else doesn't mean it will definitely work for you. And in many cases, you've already tried the other things that people advise doing. Many of us arrive at detuning and de-optimizing as a last resort because we've exhausted all the other options already. I'm going to name a bunch more steps in this video, and some of them may apply to you, but not all of them may help your situation. You don't need to do all of these steps, maybe you just need to do 1 or 2 or 3 of them. But the only way that you will know that for sure is if you are brutally honest about what your needs actually are. So the most important step 1, the thing that will set you up for success, is to properly identify your motivations. To understand how to tune down a deck, you need to be able to answer why it is that you want to do so. Is it out of nostalgia, out of boredom, the desire to see more individual cards that you happen to be fond of, or to see specific decision points in game that you wish would happen more often? Is it to challenge yourself? Is it to break a bad habit? Answering those honestly is how you'll know which of these steps applies best to your situation. If it's about recentering the joy of the game, then critically engage with what is it that brings you joy. That's how you can find the subsequent steps that will apply to you. Step 2, the Powerhouse Pass. This is the most obvious step once you start tinkering with your list. We start big. Often, not always, but often, there are a few big culprits that cause the worst feelings in your deck. So when you truly start picking apart your deck for ways to take it from a boil to a simmer, your first pass should be the big guns. For instance, evaluate your game changers. These cards have been labeled as exceptionally powerful, so yoinking those out of a list, as well as things like 2-card infinite combos, is often a very easy way to begin to scale back. Free spells and fast mana could be a part of the equation here too. Free spells tend to be game changers, but not always, and those 0 mana interaction points tend to be more at home and more dynamic in the dedicated bracket 4 and up territory, not the tuning things down territory. And fast mana in your deck is a huge signal that you are trying to operate a turn ahead of your opponents, so that's a pretty easy thing to pull out of a deck too, to make sure that the deck will pace itself a little bit more appropriately. Another obvious example, another early step that a whole bunch of folks run into real fast is, of course, removing tutors from a list. Speaking for myself, I haven't been playing tutors for a really long time because I enjoy the variance and novelty and tension of the unexpected, and I personally just wearied of cards that could always find the right answer. This, of course, isn't a moral judgment on the players who do enjoy playing any of those cards. It's just that if we are trying to make a deck a little bit less optimized, these are the things that we ought to look for first. So if your deck does have a bunch of tutors already, I don't know, consider swapping them out for more draw spells. That will help you dig a bit more, and maybe you'll find what you need in that way instead. And even if you don't find what you need, I bet you'll still enjoy drawing a bunch of cards, or psyching out your opponents by making them think that you drew what you were looking for. Removing things like tutors and combos and game changers unquestionably made my decks weaker, but it also forced me to get better at thinking on my feet when my back's against the wall, to try other tactics in order to get out of a tight spot, to do things like bluffing, or to attempt riskier moves than I would normally feel comfortable doing. In my case, looking back at step 1, tuning down my decks in this way was motivated by a desire to improve at these parts of the game. Even though this is a very obvious step, identify the power outliers, the thing that's so great about this step is that it can detune a deck while still appealing to a very universal motivation. As I just said, I really enjoyed removing tutors, removing game changers to make things a smidge more challenging. A lot of players will enjoy seeing if they can still win a game even without a fully optimized toolkit. Go be Rock Lee and see if you can still win a game even with those weight restraints on, right? But remember, this is just one of the steps, not the only step. Removing those types of cards from a list might be an appropriate first move, but it's very possible to have a powerful deck without any combos or game changers in them. The presence of a game changer alone is not the only thing that determines the power level of a deck or its placement within the bracket system. Like, even if you don't particularly enjoy the brackets, you gotta admit, just removing one card from a deck hardly sounds like the way to de-optimize it. So if you are seriously interested in scaling a deck back, don't just remove a T-Pro and a Smothering Tithe and call it a day. That'd be kind of phoning it in, and I think we all know it. It's a great first move, but examine the other steps too to see whether or not they also apply. And we'll get to those other steps right after a quick shout out to our sponsors. Summer's come up, which means I, like so many folks out there, need clothes that can keep up. Stuff that you can move around in without sweating a whole bunch. Stuff that you can lounge in to keep cool, but then also if all your friends want to go to dinner or something, you can go out in that too. Which is why I'm so happy to tell you that this episode is sponsored by Fabletics. Fabletics offers you athleisure wear that looks dang good, and when you sign up as a new VIP, you get 70 to 80% off everything. New VIPs unlock major savings on their first purchase, so stocking up on comfortable, versatile pieces doesn't feel like some huge splurge. Made it real easy for me to get multiple workout shirts and everyday staples for summer without overthinking it. I've been wearing these tan joggers nonstop. I freaking love these things. They're lightweight but durable, breathable, but also built to last. I just absolutely adore them. And especially because I've been traveling so much lately too. I've either been on a plane or on the road 6 times in the past month, and these joggers became my immediate go-to because they're comfy as heck, whether I have to sit still in one place for a while or if I'm hustling through an airport. So happy to recommend Fabletics, and so happy that they're sponsoring this episode. Shop now at fabletics.com/EDATREK to get 70 to 80% off everything when you sign up as a new VIP. Take a quick style quiz and be sure to select EDATREK when prompted to unlock this offer. This is a limited time offer, so don't wait. Again, that's fabletics.com/EDATREK for 70 to 80% off everything as a new VIP. A huge thank you to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the channel. Dragon Shield recently dropped their new Dragon Lock system on their deck boxes. Magnetized deck boxes that are super secure to keep your deck in place. Boxes with room for 100 double-sleeved cards, room for tokens. They have this window in the front to show off your commander too. Plus really intuitive grip spacing when you open the box that makes it so easy to grab your deck. It's the little touches like that that make this such a cool new line of deck boxes. Check out dragonshield.com/EDHREC and use promo code EDHREC for a discount. Again, that's dragonshield.com/EDHREC and promo code EDHREC, all lowercase, at checkout for a discount. The show is also brought to you by the brilliant patrons at patreon.com/EDHRECcast. Lou Descalzo, I hope you go first in your next Commander game. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get back to the video. Alright, back to it. Step 3 for tuning a deck down is to interrogate your win conditions. If a deck is always winning in the same way, that A, can reduce the novelty a bit, but B, could be evidence of a deck that is hyper-streamlined, and streamlining is a telltale sign of optimization. Again, not that optimization is a bad thing, just that if your goal is to tone things down a little bit, then this is a big flashing neon sign that could be alerting you to the source. I find that this step is the most relevant for those who are trying to pivot from a bracket 3 type of space to a bracket 2 type of space. So like Craterhoof Behemoth, Blightsteel Colossus, Torment of Hailfire. These are probably the types of cards that popped into your head as things that you could remove if you wanted to defang your deck. These cards are famous in this category for a reason. They are so powerful at what they do that they rarely miss. I know that we as a community kind of just name these big examples as defaults when it comes to win conditions, especially win conditions that have a bit of a reputation. That makes those cards very obvious examples, but the point of this step is to think past those obvious examples. A deck might still have the optimization problem, even if it's not running any of those Craterhoof or Torment of Hailfire type of cards. This philosophy can and should apply to other cards in your list too, because any win condition that your deck is always pointed towards could be the problem. For instance, in my Mimiplasm deck, which is a very high power deck, one of the best targets for my commander to become a copy of is Walking Ballista, because I can instantly deal tons of damage to the entire table with that card. But if I were to detune that deck, that's probably the first card that I would cut, because in lower power places, I wouldn't want there to be a card that basically always wins the game if I make my commander a copy of it. I'd want to instead opt for win conditions that just aren't as reliable, because I would want to give those cards a chance to prove themselves too, but also because I wouldn't want to create a play pattern that always dominates every time. Or, if your black deck always wins whenever you draw Sir Conrad, maybe consider cutting him to see whether or not your deck is relying upon that win condition too often, and to see whether or not your deck can adjust in the absence of its MVP. Serena Williams and Lionel Messi had to call out sick. What can your deck do now? Those always effective win cons are amazing, and in the right spaces, you should play them in plenty of decks. I love Conrad. I completely understand people who love a Craterhoof Behemoth. I think in bracket 3, all of those cards that I've named can be really, really exciting. But even within bracket 3, if you are trying to tone things down, then the move for you should be to identify those good old reliables that always win or that always win in the same ways, and to swap them for other win conditions that have slightly more obvious hurdles to them. Now, don't completely cut your win cons, obviously. I'm just saying examine them to see whether or not a change would do you good in this area. And if you do change them, make sure that you still keep the same modes of victory too. I'm not advising here that you should change your Voltron deck's win con into something that tries to win with a life loss instead of commander damage. I'm just saying maybe look at the equipment to see whether or not that deck is always winning specifically because of a Sword of Feast and Famine or whatever. Or for another example, a White Weenies deck where the goal is to swarm the board with tokens. If Moonshaker Cavalry is the win con that basically always does the job every time, and you are craving a lighter pace of gameplay, then swap that out for another Anthem. An example that I like is the card Champions from Beyond, which needs you to hit a certain threshold of creatures in order to provide its pump effect at all. Changing your win con options to things like that provides you with a challenge, a hurdle that you must overcome, which also gives your opponents easily identifiable ways to stop you. Even if they can't actually stop you in those games, the fact that your win con has these more obvious fail points often makes for more satisfying gameplay when you're in those less cutthroat territories. A Craterhoof and a Torment don't feel good because they almost always definitely do the thing, whereas a Champions of Beyond feels interesting because it doesn't almost always definitely do the thing. That provides just enough of a speed bump in the game that you'll need that extra beat before you can reliably make the thing happen, which I find is a better tempo match when you're trying to back away from the most optimized versions of gameplay. Step 4. Be a little irrational. Step 4 is probably the hardest step to identify, but it is one of the most important. I think that this one takes some practice, and I'll provide some examples to better illustrate what I'm talking about here, but basically the gist is to identify the cards in your deck that are, technically speaking, precise and perfect cards for the deck, but which bring you absolutely no joy whatsoever. In my experience, the reason that we begin to fall out of love with a deck or with specific cards is because those cards feel like they're just kind of going through the motions. And that happens most often with the cards that prioritize optimization. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Jinx Monsoon here. I would rather watch a joyful performance than a step-perfect performance. This is the perfect philosophy for tuning a deck down, because we need to get more in touch with the silly stuff that just makes us smile and become more comfortable with not being perfect at our deck's choreography if we want our attempts at de-optimization to be successful. Let me give an example from my own personal history here. My Barakos deck is all about assembling a party, so I need good, cheap creatures that fit the bill, interesting rogues and wizards and stuff like that. So, logically, I understand that the rogue Douthie Voidwalker would be really, really good in that deck. But for some reason, I hate it. I just don't like it. I just don't feel joy when I draw that card in that deck. The best way that I can even try to describe it is that it felt to me like that was a card that fulfilled a mechanical obligation rather than a card that made me excited. So as I tuned around with the power level of that deck, that's a card that I took out. Or my Winter deck. It wants to fill up the graveyard so that I can revive enormous enchantments and artifacts and overrun the table with big baddies. I traded into a Palantir of Orthanc on Cardsphere. Shout out to Cardsphere, by the way, really cool way to trade cards that you're not using for cards that you will use. Link below, etc., etc. And that is a badass card that will scry and then either give you extra card draw or fill up your yard while making your opponents wager whether or not they'll take damage. By rights, that card is awesome, and initially I really loved playing it, but over time, for whatever reason, I've become a little bit weary of it. It's so good at its job. It's perfect for that deck, but maybe the fact that it is perfect for the deck made me feel a little bit less excited by it. It became a really big example of the ways that I was subconsciously beginning to prioritize the best cards for the deck over the vibes of the game. They felt like the right cards to play rather than the cards that I wanted to play. I don't have a rational reason for disliking those cards in those decks. And in other decks, I bet that Palantir or Douthie Voidwalker could be a huge source of joy for other players because of the different synergies that they open up in other places. So this doesn't make sense. It isn't rational. I cannot tell you that cutting those cards from those lists was the right move. But that's the point of this super important step in the de-optimization process. It's not supposed to be rational. You probably shouldn't have a good, easy to explain reason. All that I know is that for whatever reason, I didn't enjoy playing those cards in that deck. And that's enough. And when I took those cards out of those decks, it kind of forced some creativity out of me, which also had the happy benefit of cleaning up my perspective on what it is that those decks need to accomplish on each of my turns. AKA, it put me back in touch with the simple joys of Magic again. So if there are some of those cards where your initial gut feeling when you see them is not excitement, but maybe almost a nothing impression, or even at worst, a feeling of slight hollowness when you see them, which is probably a strong word, but I think you know what I mean, consider whether those are the cards that you ought to yoink out of that list when you're trying to tune things down. Those could be the cards that end up putting the focus on best moves, rather than putting the focus on letting you lean back and go with the flow. Those might be some of the cards that are collectively inching you towards optimization, so that could be what you cut in order to make room for the sillier plays or for your pet cards instead. Step 5, the removal problem. Alright, this is a tricky one. Removal. A higher number of removal and interaction spells is very commonly associated with the more optimal ends of the gameplay spectrum. So if super tuned decks play tons of interaction, then surely when you're detuning a deck, you should play fewer removal spells, right? The thing is, I'm actually not going to recommend that it's always correct to lower your removal and interaction count when you're trying to de-optimize a list. I actually think that the number of removal spells and lands, frankly, is still probably a skosh too low for the average player. Like, I seriously still see landfall decks that only have 35 lands, and I'm like, stop! Bad. A higher land count will help you actually cast the spells that you enjoy. So no matter what your goals are, just please play enough lands, please. But yeah, even if technically removing your interaction spells would make your deck worse, I don't think that that's the right direction that everyone ought to go when you're trying to de-optimize. Now let's clarify. If you have over 5 board wipes, if you have like 10 counter spells, if you have 20 removal spells, then yeah, that's probably overboard. But some players don't have enough removal or interaction in the first place, and I actually sometimes would recommend bringing your interaction count up even when you're trying to tune a deck down. This is probably a slightly contentious stance though, so just allow me to make my case. So first things first, I do think there are certain types of removal and interaction that absolutely should go if you're de-optimizing. Grave Pact effects, for instance, can shut entire archetypes off, or I take Constant Mists out of my lists when I want to tone things down because that's a card that absolutely just ends the run of my aggro and Voltron opponents on the spot. Or you should absolutely have some one-off graveyard exile stuff, but a card like Rest in Peace, which exiles, I feel like maybe that's veering a little bit into the silver bullet territory, which I personally associate with the needs of more heightened and optimal gameplay experiences. And I know, I'm a graveyard player, so of course I hate Rest in Peace, right? Feel free to take that last example with a grain of salt. I know I'm biased. So certain types of removal, yeah, I would cut those when I'm detuning, but I wouldn't cut a ton of removal when I'm detuning, because even if you're not playing optimally, your deck should have ways to mess with your opponent's plans. Here's an example that I think will highlight what I'm getting at here. Take my Barakos Party Treasures deck again. If I'm scaling that one down, I'm not just cutting Deadly Rollick. I'm going to cut that card and then replace it with a card like, say, Dispatch. That's a removal spell that only works if I've been able to make and keep treasures. That's still a removal spell slot, but now it's just a card that has a pretty exciting condition. I've gone from a best-in-class card to a situational card, which introduces some ambiguity and adds a clever texture to the game. A dash more removal will make your game more interactive, and one of the fastest ways to start producing awesome moments in your own game is when you have meaningful interaction points against your opposition, and awesome moments in the game is kind of the whole damn point. Truly, think about your least favorite games that you've ever played or seen. What features did they have? Power imbalance, turn 1 Soul Rings, someone missing a bunch of land drops? All good answers that, yeah, do often lead to games that people aren't satisfied with. But I think another good example is that the least interesting games are ones that don't have any interaction points, where one person just went unimpeded and ran everybody else over. 4 people who just are trying to see who can solitaire the fastest is not much of a game, and it will make you feel less satisfied than when you started. Remember, we're not just trying to make our decks worse. Detuning is different than kneecapping. We could also cut 20 lands from a deck, and that would make it worse too, but that misses the point. Here, what we're trying to do is make a deck that is still playable, just not so cutthroat. Plus, another reason that I think removal is a really big ingredient even in tuning things down is because removal spells are often one of the most fertile grounds for neat synergistic effects. Like, yes, we all know the classics. Toxic Deluge is a fantastic, amazing board wipe. But when I'm playing my Yannette deck, which is all about odd mana cards, and I have the card Extinction Event, which can exile only even mana creatures, that is a worse card, sure, it won't hit everything, but every dang time it makes the table go, oh, cool! Or when I'm playing my Baba deck, my favorite deck of all time, the deck that I would play at all hours of the day, even if I'm asleep, the deck that if you woke me up at 4 a.m. and offered me a cup of coffee and the chance to play Babala Saga, I would ask who are other players and what's taking them so long. Anyway, that deck, when I play that deck and I sacrifice a creature at instant speed so that my Tragic Slip is active now and I can give something -13, that is clutch, and that's an exciting play even for the person who lost their guy. If I were to detune either of those decks, those elements would still stay. Those are not the most optimal removal spells, but they make for great gameplay moments. And the reason that we're toning things down in the first place is because we are in the pursuit of a different form of great gameplay moments. So again, certain types of removal, yeah, they can go, mostly the lockout forms of removal in particular. And you don't need 30 removal spells or whatever. That can obviously loop back around to sucking the joy out of the experience too. When I say that the average deck could stand to play more lands and more removal spells, I mean like 3 more of each, not 10 more of each. But yeah, tuning down a deck should still involve methods of helping you to run interference. Don't skimp on it. You'll end up hating the deck more if you rob it of its interaction opportunities. A lot of removal is often a characteristic of very optimized lists, but that doesn't mean that we remove it entirely. It means that when we are trying to detune or de-optimize, we simply evaluate our interaction more carefully. Step 6. Now we're on to the mana base. A common sign of an optimized deck is an impressive mana base. Fetches, Triomes to hit with your Farseeks, utility lands that provide you tons of mana, things that give you really clutch benefits like a Plaza of Heroes, stuff like that. I bet a lot of players would expect the advice that to detune your deck properly, you should strip the mana base a little bit or something like that. But I personally don't think that you actually need to go very far in this category. Like, you don't need to revert back to only basic lands or only budget duels or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, a souped up mana base to help your color fixing is a perfectly normal thing to have, even in a deck where you're trying to lower the volume on it a little bit. Get your colors so that you can play your spells. De-optimizing shouldn't mean that you can't cast your stuff. A bracket 2 deck can absolutely contain an original dual land. That's an expensive card, yeah, but it isn't the reason that deck is powerful. Instead, I think the real target here is your utility lands. That's the thing that you have to examine. Not all of your utility lands need to go. Still keep plenty of them. Utility lands are freaking awesome. But for instance, I used to have a Core Haven in a deck, a land which can fog a single creature, and when I de-optimized that list, that was the first card that I cut. I now reserve that type of utility land for my more intentionally higher power lists. Again, utility lands are bomb. I love playing them. Like, I will play Mosswart Bridge almost any chance that I get. But I'm not going to play Otawara any chance that I get. Does that make sense? That's the distinction that I'm trying to get at here. Finding cool utility lands is a really fun part of deck building, so that's why, to me, this step is a little bit less important than a lot of the others. You don't need to gut a mana base to make a deck more chill, but it could be the case that evaluating your utility lands and giving them a glance over does help you along the process of figuring out how to make your deck more in line with where you'd like it to be. And now, step 7. This is the last step, and also I think kind of the last resort step too, and that's to check your redundancies. One of the biggest things that can make a deck more powerful is how consistent it's able to be. If your deck will benefit from playing lands from your graveyard, for instance, and your deck is already running Crucible of Worlds, Raminab Excavator, Ice-Till Explorer, Walk-in Closet, Conduit Worlds, and Ancient Green Warden, plus all of the other spells that will bring back all of your lands from the graveyard en masse, well, that is a really solid lands from graveyard package. It just also might be the exact thing that is lending your deck the consistency that it needs to always be the main character of every game you play. And honestly, maybe that's a bad example. This is a very tricky step because it isn't about individually powerful cards here. Instead, it's about overall trends in the list. We're talking ocean currents, not any individual fish that swims in them. Identifying those things can be really difficult. You really have to look at your lists from a bird's eye view, and that can be a tough skill that requires a lot of practice to get right. For more advice on that, see my deck categories video, where I show you a little bit how even just using things like custom categories in your brewing can make you a better player. And the other tricky part of this too is that certain categories within a deck should still stay high. More card advantage, for instance, will help you to find cool stuff to do. Good card flow matters even if you are playing in a more leaned back way. De-optimizing a deck doesn't mean that you should get stuck top decking all game. That would be lame. And I'm also not talking about cutting down on your deck's big plan cards either. If your deck is trying to make a lot of tokens, for instance, then of course you should have a high density of token makers. That part of your deck should have redundancy. You should not skimp on that. And it's going to be nice to have a couple of options for payoffs too. Some cards in your deck that give it the extra oomph to close out a game and keep things from stalling out. Don't go cutting all of your win conditions. You want more than one of those, yeah. So yeah, some categories absolutely should have high densities within a deck. But the categories we're trying to identify in this step are the ones that are lingering evidence of optimization. This is about the enablers that make it so that your deck never really has to sweat, even a little bit. A very high density of 1 mana dorks, for instance, or a lot of protection spells, a consistent number of haste providers that you're always able to rush out the gates. A high density of stuff that supports your plan, not the stuff that is the plan. This is a tough distinction. Like I said, this is a very tricky thing to identify properly. Basically, if you're guaranteed that you'll always have what you need during a game, that is great. It just also is the hallmark of a very tuned up list. If you're never at a loss for sacrifice outlets, you always have a piece of protection in your hand whenever you need one. If you're never saying, oh, I wish I had blank right now, then that could be a sign that your deck is still tuned up extremely well, which again is awesome, but it just might be at odds with any desire that you feel to de-optimize or scale things back. Perhaps an easier way to say this is to locate your deck's Achilles heel, and rather than trying to rush to cover up that weakness, if you are permitting yourself to play a more laid-back version of a deck, simply allow that vulnerability to exist. That's right, I have become your therapist. I am asking you to be more vulnerable. Just see whether there's a big category of effects that provides a level of consistency and reliability that prevents your deck from ever really struggling at all in its pursuit of doing the thing. Hopefully the other steps will have solved this issue before you get to this point, but this still could be an area to investigate and to toy with if you want to try to make it so that your deck is a little bit less certain and doesn't always have the right cards. That kind of change could make it so that you have to pivot more often during a game, or more regularly improvise on the spot, or have to overcome more unique and difficult challenges. But I do kind of think that those types of decision points are very characteristic of super engaging lower level gameplay. So this could be the kind of thing that you need to feel like you've actually properly, finally turned your deck from this optimized powerhouse into something that is less predictable and more playful. Those are the 7 steps that I advise when you're trying to detune and de-optimize a deck. But I do actually also have kind of a final secret one. Be prepared to lose. Going from a bullet train to taking the scenic route, from a deck that always does the thing to a deck that has to think on its feet a little bit more, that can be a little bit of a jarring experience sometimes. That can give you a kind of mental whiplash. So make sure that you're gonna be okay with not always having the answer during a game. Give yourself a minute to truly bask in that negative space, to feel the absence of your own velocity. De-optimizing does mean losing a little bit more. So embrace that discomfort. Sometimes you made the moves that will be right for you, that are the healthy option for what you were pursuing, but the satisfaction of that can take a moment to settle in. So don't announce the results of your changes too hastily. Changing your deck isn't just about the cards, it's also about your frame of mind. So give yourself enough time to actually feel the gears shift in your own brain to make sure that you've given those experiments a truly fair shake. And remember, detuning a deck may not always be the right move. Sometimes the right solution is to tone things down, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes if you're feeling disenchanted with an optimized deck, all you actually need is to just take a break from the game for a little while to go play a different board game or a different format. Sometimes you're like me and you do those other things, and then you still come back and still look at your decks and you're like, okay, you need to calm down, buddy. But other times, even just taking a little break can scratch the right itch and help you to come back to your decks with a better perspective on them. And that could help put you back into the right frame of mind to remember what it is that you like about them so much. I hope those steps are helpful for you, and if you think I missed anything, then hit up the comments. Let me know your favorite versions of detuning or de-optimizing, or different ways that you found that are helpful to bring your decks in line with your intentions. Thank you again to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the show. Thank you to patrons at patreon.com/EDHRECast, and thank you for watching. If you like videos like this, subscribe. There's a whole lot more where they came from. And as always, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.